So much about the environmental debate today is about energy. It's about the costs and impacts of developing energy resources. It's about the costs and impacts of providing energy, either to our vehicles, to our industries, to power our homes. So much of the debate in Washington right now about energy and climate is all focused on global warming and the impacts of trying to completely revamp and revise our entire energy infrastructure in a very short amount of time with what we feel are some inordinate and in fact enormous costs to us as consumers and to the state as business operators. For the first time in my memory, this is why I think this area is one where we had tremendous success this last session. For the first time in my memory, and I've been doing this for 30 years, not a single bill passed the Texas legislature that imposed any new significant regulatory burden in the environmental arena on businesses. And I think that is an enormous compliment again to the folks who were affected by some of those potential pieces of legislation, who let their voices be heard about what the potential impacts were. And quite frankly, it did help that in this current economic climate, we can make the argument that even something that seems very innocuous at this point is simply not appropriate. You probably recall sometime in the not too distant past, a lot of debate about new electric generating facilities being proposed in the state of Texas, and a lot of concern about the impact of those facilities on our air quality. A lot of that is happening at the time that the Environmental Protection Agency and the federal government are continuing to ratchet down the standards for what they consider to be adequate air quality standards. So we have this sort of collision course between our needs for new power, our needs to develop new generation capacity to make sure we have enough electricity in this state. Again, remember, we are a net exporter of energy because of a tremendous manufacturing base in Texas. We don't generate power in Texas because we waste it. We don't generate power in Texas because we don't use it as effectively as other states. Quite frankly, it's the opposite. We generate electricity in this state because we export energy, and we export goods and services to the extent that we are, depending on who you talk to, somewhere between the 8th and the 10th largest economy in the world. So it only stands to reason that we need the power that we need because we export that through the goods and services that we manufacture. But what's happening is the federal government is continuing to ratchet down the air quality standards. It doesn't mean the air is getting worse. It means that their perception of what is adequate air quality is getting more and more stringent. The unintended consequence of that, though, in the minds of many of the public members and many of the legislatures that we debated during the session, is that when you try to make the permitting process more difficult, to make it harder to get a new permit for a coal-fired generating facility, for instance, what you're actually doing is ensuring that you will never build a newer, cleaner facility. Most of the measures that the legislature debated this last session had to do with some extremely onerous and very technical requirements to demonstrate that a facility would have no air quality impact. Well, the problem is if you set the threshold for that so high, that facility never gets built. If that facility never gets built, even though it operates more efficiently, even though it operates more effectively, and by effectively I mean cost effectively, it's cheaper to operate. That means it never goes online, it never replaces an older unit that is less cost effective and could be taken offline. So you have this sort of chicken and egg, which comes first? Do we take the old plant offline before we build the new one? Well, if we do that, what happens to our grid and our power availability? There has to be some trust and some understanding in the permitting process that you have to be able to build new facilities so you can take old facilities offline. And that was our major debate during this last session. And we were successful in ensuring that those onerous permitting provisions were not put into place. Another significant effort had to do with cement camps. Obviously, since the geology in this area is very similar to some of the other areas where we have a lot of cement manufacturing, this is an area that would have potentially been affected by some of these provisions, particularly with increasing air quality concerns in our urban areas, so locally the San Antonio, Austin area. Some members of the Dallas-Fort Worth delegation were attempting to put measures into place that would have given local school districts, TxDOT, any local government that was contracting to buy cement, to essentially put bid preference specifications in place that said, we're going to buy cement only if your local cement manufacturing facility doesn't emit more than X. Even after the state of Texas permit engineer has said X is not technically achievable. which meant that a local school district or a local government, or TxDOT for that matter, would have been allowed by law to spend more money to buy that cement, even if it meant hauling it in by truck from Oklahoma. With the perverse impact that all the truck emissions from hauling it from Oklahoma would have worsened the situation instead of bettering the situation. But again, you had some folks in Dallas-Fort Worth that are extremely concerned about their local economy and the potential impacts of failing to meet federal air standards. We just felt that was the wrong way to go about trying to solve that problem by essentially taking the problem, letting somebody else outside the DFW area solve it for them. We didn't think that was appropriate, and we successfully defeated that effort. The state of Texas, however, did pass some extremely significant environmental legislation this last session. We put in place efforts to incentivize new clean coal technology. We put in place efforts to study and look at the feasibility of greenhouse gas sequestration. We have a perfect assembly of facts in Texas. One is we have a very significant oil and gas industry that uses carbon dioxide in order to make oil more recoverable from formations. We also have the largest publicly owned, that is owned by the state, public lands in the Gulf. And that derives back from the fact that our public lands are much more extensive than the other states, because as a country in 1845, we brought with us the territorial seas that were granted under Spanish law and subsequently under Mexican law. So we have 3 times the amount of land under the Gulf that is owned by the state of Texas that has tremendous oil and gas reserves in it. It's also perfectly situated geologically to store carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases. Well, guess who benefits if we can find a way to economically store greenhouse gases in our publicly owned lands? Our public schools, public universities, and our public schools. So we have a perfect juxtaposition of issues in the state of Texas where if the federal government is going to insist that we do this, Texas is the best state that is best situated to take advantage of it and actually benefit financially from it, particularly if there's going to be a market on the storage of greenhouse gases. So whether you agree with global warming or not, even if it is forced on us by Washington, the Texas legislature has very wisely put in place a mechanism for the state to benefit from that. We actually have done things on the ground. The state of Texas, each of you, individually, are putting money, quite frankly, where our mouths are. We are doing things to reduce emissions. We are doing things to innovate new technology. The state of Texas has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in cleaning up our air in the last 10 to 15 years. From electric generating units alone, the state of Texas has reduced over 250,000 tons of ozone precursors a year. That's a lot. And when you tell that to somebody from New York or California or other states that argue about air quality and try to paint Texas as a sort of backwards, pro-industry, anything goes state, and you tell them that, they suddenly realize how big that number is, and they ask themselves the question, how did you do that? Well, we did it by incentivizing new technologies and basically putting our money into those types of programs. Washington is still talking about doing it. You've heard about the Waxman-Markey global warming energy bill that barely passed the House, and now there's a version being debated in the Senate. Once you get past the cap and trade parts of it, which is how Washington wants to completely distort our economy to completely shift our energy markets, when you get to the back parts of the bill, they talk about doing things to incentivize greenhouse gas sequestration. The Texas legislature just did it. They talk about putting new fees and taxes on things like automobile registrations to create a pool of money to incentivize new technology. The Texas legislature did it 9 years ago. We've been doing it for almost a decade now. Any of you that have diesel fleets, you may have already heard about and participated in the diesel emission reduction plan, where TCQ will actually give you money to minimize the cost difference of retrofitting your diesel equipment. We've been doing that for years in Texas. So all these things that are suddenly great ideas in Washington, D.C. for how to clean up our air and our environment, Texas did years ago, and we continue to do. And in fact, the Texas legislature this last session took that entire program and expanded it to include grants and new incentives for new emission control technology, grants for the conversion of fleets to new alternative fuel vehicles, natural gas vehicles. It always amazes me that Texas gets painted as this sort of dragging behind everyone else in terms of consciousness about our